Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. Read by Annalisa Kadri. Chapter 1. My Early Home. The first place that I can well remember was a large pleasant meadow with a pond of clear water in it. Some trees overshadowed the pond, and rushes and water lilies grew at the deep end. Over the hedge on one side we looked into a ploughed field, and on the other we looked over a gate at our master's house which stood by the roadside. At the top of the meadow was a plantation of fir trees, and at the bottom a running brook overhung by a steep bank. Whilst I was young I lived upon my mother's milk, as I could not eat grass. In the daytime I ran by her side, and at night I lay down close by her. When it was hot, we used to stand by the pond in the shade of the trees, and when it was cold, we had a nice warm shed near the plantation. As soon as I was old enough to eat grass, my mother used to go out to work in the daytime and to come back in the evening. There were 6 young colts in the meadow besides me. They were older than I was. Some were nearly as large as grown-up horses. I used to run with them and have great fun. We used to gallop all together round and round the field as hard as we could go. Sometimes we had rather rough play, for they'd frequently bite and kick as well as gallop. One day, when there was a good deal of kicking, my mother whinnied to me to come to her, and then she said, "I wish you to pay attention to what I'm going to say to you. The colts who live here are very good colts, but they are cart-horse colts, and, of course, they have not learned good manners. You have been well bred and well born. Your father has a great name in these parts, and your grandfather twice won the cup at the Newmarket races. Your grandmother had the sweetest temper of any horse I ever knew, and I think you have never seen me kick or bite. I hope you'll grow up gentle and good, and never learn bad ways. Do your work with a good will. Lift up your feet well when you trot, and never bite or kick, even in play." I have never forgotten my mother's advice. I knew she was a wise old horse, and our master thought a great deal of her. Her name was Duchess, but he often called her Pet. Our master was a good, kind man. He gave us good food, good lodging, and kind words, and he spoke as kindly to us as he did to his little children. We were all fond of him, and my mother loved him very much. When she saw him at the gate, she would neigh with joy and trot up to him. He would pat and stroke her and say, "Well, old Pet, how's your little darky?" I was a dull black, so he called me Darky. Then he would give me a piece of bread, which was very good, and sometimes he brought a carrot for my mother. All the horses would come to him, but I think we were his favourites. My mother always took him to the town on a market day in a light gig. There was a ploughboy, Dick, who sometimes came into our field to pluck blackberries from the hedge. When he'd eaten all he wanted, he would have what he called fun with the colts, throwing sticks and stones at them to make them gallop. We did not much mind him, for we could gallop off, but sometimes a stone would hit and hurt us. One day he was at this game, and did not know that the master was in the next field, but he was there, watching what was going on. Over the hedge he jumped in a moment, and catching Dick by the arm gave him such a box on the ear as made him roar with pain. Soon as we saw the master, we trotted up nearer to see what was going on. "Bad boy," he said, "bad boy to chase the colts. This is not the first time, nor the second, but it shall be the last. There, take your money and go home. I shall not want you on my farm again." So we never saw Dick again. Old Daniel, the man who looked after the horses, was just as gentle as our master, so we were well off. Chapter 2. The Hunt. Before I was 2 years old, a circumstance happened which I have never forgotten. It was early in the spring. There'd been a little frost in the night, and a light mist still hung over the plantations and meadows. The other colts and I were feeding in the lower part of the field when we heard, quite in the distance, what sounded like the cry of dogs. The oldest of the colts raised his head, pricked up his ears, and said, "There are the hounds!" and immediately cantered off, followed by the rest of us, to the upper part of the field, where we could look over the hedge and see several fields beyond. My mother and an old riding horse of our master were also standing near, and seemed to know all about it. "They have found a hare," said my mother, and if they come this way, we shall see the hunt." Soon the dogs were all tearing down the field of young wheat next to our meadow. I never heard such a noise as they made. They did not bark, nor howl, nor whine, but kept up a yo, 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 yo at the top of their voices. After them came a number of men on horseback, some of them in green coats, all galloping as fast as they could. The old horse snorted and looked eagerly after them, and we young colts wanted to be galloping with them, but they were soon away in the fields lower down. Here it seemed as if they'd come to a stand. The dogs left off barking and ran about in every direction with their noses to the ground. "They've lost the scent," said the old horse. "Perhaps the hare will get off." "What hare?" I said. "Oh, I don't know what hare. Possibly it may be one of our own hares out of the plantation. Any hare they can find will do for the dogs and men to run after." Before long the dogs began their yo-yo-yo-yo again, and back they came all together at full speed, making straight for our meadow at the part where the high bank and hedge overhung the brook. "Now we shall see the hare," said my mother, and just then a hare, wild with fright, rushed by and made for the plantation. On came the dogs, followed by the huntsman. The dogs burst through the bank, leaped the stream, and came dashing across the field. 6 or 8 men leaped their horses clean over the hedge and stream, following close upon the dogs. The hare tried to get through the fence, but it was too thick, and she turned sharp round to make for the road. Alas, it was too late. The dogs were upon her with their wild cries. We heard one shriek, and that was the end of her. One of the huntsmen rode up and whipped off the dogs, who would soon have torn her to pieces. He held her up by the leg, torn and bleeding, and all the gentlemen seemed well pleased. As for me, I was so astonished that I did not at first see what was going on by the brook, but when I did look, there was a sad sight. 2 fine horses were down. One was struggling in the stream and the other was groaning on the grass. One of the riders, covered with mud, was getting out of the water. The other lay quite still. "His neck is broken," said my mother. "And serve him right too," said one of the colts. I thought the same, but my mother did not join with us. "Well, no," she said, "you must not say that. But though I am an old horse and I have seen and heard a great deal, I never yet could make out why men are so fond of this sport. They often hurt themselves, spoil good horses and tear up the fields, and all this for a hare, a fox or a stag that they could get more easily some other way. But we are only horses and don't understand." Whilst my mother was saying this, we stood and looked on. Many of the riders had gone to the young man, but my master, who'd been watching what was going on, was the first to raise him. His head fell back and his arms hung down, and everyone looked very serious. There was no noise now. Even the dogs were quiet and seemed to know that something was wrong. They carried him to our master's house. I heard afterwards that the young fellow was George Gordon, the squire's only son, a fine, tall young man and the pride of his family. People were now riding off in all directions, to the doctor's, to the farrier's, and no doubt to Squire Gordon to let him know about his son. When Mr. Bond, the farrier, came to look at the black horse that lay groaning on the grass, he felt him all over and shook his head. One of the horse's legs was broken. Then someone ran to our master's house and came back with a gun. Presently there was a loud bang and a dreadful shriek, and then all was still. The black horse moved no more. My mother seemed much troubled. She said she'd known that horse for years. His name was Rob Roy, a good, bold horse with no vice in him. Afterwards, she never would go to that part of the field. Not many days after, we heard the church bell tolling for a long time, and looking over the gate we saw a long, strange black coach covered with black cloth and drawn by black horses. After that came another, and another, and another, and all were black. Meanwhile the bell kept tolling, tolling. They were carrying young Gordon to the churchyard to bury him. He would never ride again. What they did with Rob Roy I never knew, but 'twas all for one little hare.